From chapter 5 of James T. Shotwell's At the Paris Peace Conference, a chapter entitled Social Justice in the Peace Treaties. All of the work done by the Paris Peace Conference which this narrative chiefly deals with will be judged by many students of its history to be the least interesting. The erection of a world organization for the problems of labor. There's nothing in it to excite political passions like the shifting of a frontier or the question of responsibility for the war. It had no touch of historical romance like the breakdown of old empires, nor did it stir the imagination like the creation of the League of Nations. In the years following the conference, it was obscured at first by the controversies over the political and economic terms of settlement and by those arising over the failure of the United States to enter the League. But the International Labor Organization, for which James T. Shotwell is the founder, dealing as it does with the homely problems of the welfare of the common man, has a universal constituency and a lasting cause to serve. It is the first creation in world's affairs of an institution participated in by workers, capital, and governments to deal with the problems that are most real to most people the world over, those that have to do with the day's work. Its name belies its nature, for it represents all interests, not merely those of labor. It is a world parliament, limited in scope to the problems that affect labor, but it acts in the name and interests of all. It might more accurately have been termed the International Industrial Conference, or better still, the International Organization for Social Justice. So there was a hint of this broader conception of the purpose and scope of the International Labor Organization in the preamble to its constitution, in the statement that universal peace can be established only if it is based on social justice. It must be confessed, however, that when we wrote those words into the text, we were not thinking of their far reach, but of a formula which would enable us to tie our institution into the structure of that new world order, which the League of Nations symbolizes. Okay, so today's show, we're going to start sort of where internationalism culminated at the Paris Peace Conference. That is James T. Shotwell, who's a key member of the inquiry and the founding of the CFR, and he is in Paris, and he is really in the role of librarian, historian there, and he's making sure that he collects all of the information. He's writing a daily diary. That is basically his book At the Paris Peace Conference. So I invite you to go check that out. It's not the only time in the book that he talks about the New World Order. He talks about all of these deals at the Paris Peace Conference happening on Rothschild land in Rothschild-owned buildings. And the plenary meetings were just for show. So for those of you that are familiar with our work and this history, this is a pattern that we see. These plenary meetings that they make a big fuss about have nothing to do with anything, like the committees and commissions of House investigations, okay? So we start at the beginning today to show you where this all sort of culminates, because this is the long road to internationalism. This thing goes back more than a century. And these are the same guys at the Paris Peace Conference. I'll show you them here in a sec. You guys have seen this picture, but we need to show this picture as many times as possible, because this is the crime scene and these are those that are complicit, most complicit in it. There's obviously some missing figures in here, but the Paris Peace Conference itself is really where everything gets established. I invite you to listen to Milton Friedman, something I just listened to again today for the first time in well over a decade. And he goes into Brandeis. He goes into the progressive movement. He goes into the Paris Peace Conference, the Treaty of Versailles, and he names some of the names that I'm naming here. So we're going to try to stick to the growth of internationalism over centuries, what I'm going to call the long road to internationalism. So welcome to the History of Propaganda, everybody. Appreciate you being here. And this is going to be another quantum leap in your understanding of history and what's going on today. So I encourage you to stick around. I appreciate all those who've been sharing our work. getting lots of feedback that this is really allowing people to see what is going on today. And so this is why I say we predict the future by knowing our past. So just some quick notes on these guys. These guys sitting in the front, Colonel House to the left there, Secretary of War Robert Lansing. Those guys did not like each other, apparently, if you listen to the official record, because it's Colonel House's inquiry, this founding of the CFR, that overthrows the State Department. And Robert Lansing is the Secretary of State, Secretary of War. Woodrow Wilson in the middle, and we've got Mr. White and Mr. Tasker Blisk. These two are probably the most prominent in international law. They've probably got the largest background in US foreign policy, because up until this point, the Americans really aren't involved in foreign entanglements. Really, this is how America was formed, or at least this is what we see in the Declaration of Independence or the US Constitution. They weren't supposed to be getting entangled in these foreign wars. But this all changes in Paris 1919, and the lead up to the American involvement in the war in 1917 to this picture here 2 years later, where they're settling post-war, going from a material force of arms that is no longer acceptable by society to an international order of law. And so these guys are key in that creation. And so who are these guys? We certainly learn a lot about their intentions and motivations if we learned who these men were. And so this is the lone wolf of Wall Street, Bernard Baruch. He's the chairman of the War Industries Board. So the moment that America goes fascist, he is at the center of all of it. Distribution, production and distribution. We talk about these two key words that Marx always talks about. Well, he's at the head of both. Beside him, we have Joseph Grew, who is at Dumbarton Oaks in 1945 to establish the UN. Many of these men are there. So this is why we say this is where it all ended, essentially, because this is the beginnings of the end. This is the beginnings of the creation of the UN. Okay, and then behind him, with his hand on Joseph Grew's shoulder here, is a young John Foster Dulles. He would eventually be Secretary of State. We've got Thomas W. Lamont here. He is J.P. Morgan representative. He is at this time known as an American fascist, along with Richard Washburn-Child. And this guy is the vice president of J.P. Morgan, Norman Davis. Norman Davis. So you can see that at the center of this picture, when you pull it back, these guys in the front sitting aren't actually really the focus of this picture. Who's dead center in the middle but Mr. Lone Wolf of Wall Street? And this is really what was going on there, guys. This was economic. This is the establishment of the 20th century economically. These guys redrew maps and created all kinds of further tension that is now extrapolated into the 21st century. These guys are really the writers of the Second World War. You can look into Frederick C. Howe, his Confessions of a Reformer, where he talks exactly about these times, and he's in the rooms with all of these guys. So in the back, we have the inquiry, future Yale president, Skull and Bones, Charles Seymour. His family goes back to medieval times. Over here, we have Clive Day. He's kind of hiding here and behind this guy. The older guy in the back row, Clive Day, he is also Skull and Bones. He is Yale grad, and there's a Day. So his family, there's at least a member of the Day family represented at Yale from its inception up until this time, at least. Okay, and then so we're going to talk about internationalism. Oh, but first we should probably mention this guy. John Foster Dulles has a brother, Allen Dulles. He ends up being the head of the CIA at the same time as his brother is the Secretary of State, and they overthrow Guatemala for bananas. And the quote that I just read was James T. Shotwell. It's probably good to get familiar with his face, right? We're going through the grammar now. You want to get to know the people, places, and things. So then we can get to the who, what, why, where, when. So James T. Shotwell, very important, super underrated figure, Canadian Quaker. He is really looked at as the primary founder of the International Labor Organization. And so those were the words that I opened this podcast with. And then most importantly, we need to look at this gentleman here. Doesn't look very appreciative that his picture is being taken, does it? But this is one of the founders of international law in our modern times, James Brown Scott. He's a key member to the inquiry. Him and David Hunter Miller are the two really most established, most experienced in international law. And I don't think this is David Hunter Miller, but it may say so on the back. Go to the legend quickly here. And some of these guys here, when you do some investigation, Whitney Shepherdson, this is really some of the founding people of US intelligence when they were secretaries long prior to the OSS, which is the precursor to the CIA. And then this gentleman here is actually the personal physician of Wilson, Grayson. And he's the personal physician of Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft. And all four of those men are Phi Beta Kappa. So we can see secret societies really are ruling. If you want, you can go back to the creation of the inquiry. I have a video on YouTube at the History of Propaganda where I go into that, all of the somewhat secretive organizations that tie all of these guys together. Okay, so let's go to the back of this page for a sec. Can we? In the right place? Yes. So here's the back of that folder. Some of you have seen this. The American Commission to Negotiate Peace delegates, picture taken at the Hotel Crillon in the Eagle Room, Paris, June 25th, 1919. So that's actually well after they've arrived. They arrived just before Christmas, 1918. So this is about 6 months after they arrive, and you can see all of the names here. Mr. Shepherdson, if you look up Whitney Shepherdson, he's one of the founders of the CIA, but here he is secretary to the inquiry. Admiral Grayson, we've mentioned. Vance McCormick, another key guy standing in that crowd along with Bernard Brooke. He's actually standing, he's literally Bernard Brooke's right-hand man in that picture. See Colonel House. Captain Hornbeck is in Dumbarton Oaks in 1945 at the creation of the UN. Many of these guys, as I said. There's Professor Coolidge, one of the founders of CFR. He's in the back row with the inquiry. Yes, he's related to Calvin Coolidge, one of the founders of the CFR. And this is why they are called the founders of the CFR, because of this moment in history. Because this is where they found both the Royal Institute of International Affairs and the CFR at the Hotel Majestic in Paris during the peace conference. It's really Cecil Rhodes' dream. The Anglo-Americans here very well represented, especially Milner's kindergarten. These are direct descendants of Cecil Rhodes, and they're establishing this dream of Cecil Rhodes that he wrote in his last will and testament. You can go look, of a British rule of the world, and it's being directed by one spot in London and one spot in New York. So that's really the story behind the creation of the CFR and the Royal Institute of International Affairs. Norman Davis, John Foster Dulles, Thomas Lamont. These are key guys to understand in this story, this long march of internationalism. Okay. Bernard Brooke. Joseph Grew. We'll get to some organizational charts here and show you just how the communication was. We pull that right out of James T. Shotwell's at the Paris Peace Conference as well. Very informative. Shows you who's boss and who's not invited. It's quite extraordinary, actually. So I call this guy the real life Indiana Jones, and he's wearing an Indiana Jones hat. This is Isaiah Bowman. He is the director of the inquiry at the AGS building. We'll get to that as well. What I'd really like to find is the organizational chart, but I don't know if it's in this pack. I think I've included this in one of the shows, but the Inter-Allied conferences and the Inter-Allied building in which a lot of this was negotiated, as I said at the beginning, happened on Rothschild land. And actually, the U.S. Embassy is former Rothschild property. You can see in 1948, they purchased it from the Rothschilds, and I have the actual receipt, if anybody doubts that. But you can see there, the Hotel Pontalba from 50 and 50, American ambassador to France. There's one of the most important guys to know in the role of internationalism, Walter Lippmann. He's considered the father of modern journalism by one of the world's most prestigious schools of journalism at Columbia. And here's the organizational chart of the American delegation. So that group picture that I showed you, that's the American delegation. There's obviously many delegations there. And so the first chart I want to show you, and you've seen this before probably, but when we talk about the rise of internationalism, we got to go back to the inquiry, the creation of the CFR, because that's really the US foreign policy mouthpiece at this point. At least it's been traditionally. You can see Mr. Lansing, Mr. White, Mr. House, and Bliss. They are considered the plenipotentiaries. And then communication goes directly to Joseph Grew, Secretary Supervising Director, and then down to Marlborough Churchill, who is the creator of the Black Chamber. This is the creation of the NSA. And what everybody thought that Truman did was combining the State Department and the War Department, created this giant monolithic NSA. Well, it's actually Marlborough Churchill is the co-founder of the Black Chamber, and it happened like the military-industrial complex long before the 50s. And this is the precursor to the precursor to the precursor. This is really the founding of U.S. intelligence, U.S. foreign policy. And then you can see here under the heading intelligence, we've got the inquiry. And so they all were division chiefs, and they were all responsible for certain territories in Central Europe and Europe, because these are the guys that redrew the maps. And so they had to go to the scholars and the political experts. This is why they chose the AGS building, because that was probably the primary place for cartography or map making. And Isaiah Bowman today is considered one of the real three founders of cartography in America. So there he is listed as the Chief Territorial Specialist and Executive Officer. They've got Sidney Mezes here listed as Director, or Mises. But he's really just a front figure. As far as I can see, he's not really important, other than he is the father or brother-in-law to Colonel Edward Mandell House. And Mandell House has a couple of those here around him, including Auchincloss. So you can see Charles Homer Haskins in the upper left. This is the guy that really designs our curriculum and established the entire system of how we learn history. Okay, so I'm going to show you a great example here of how the history is told by the victors, and he's one of the key guys. So your intuition to think that is totally correct, and these are the guys that did it. Okay, I'm giving you the source material for those things that you know to be true. And I would consider this a primary source. It's coming straight out of James T. Shotwell's book. He is the librarian. He is the president of Carnegie, there's a division in Carnegie that he is the president of. He's working directly under Elihu Root. So the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace is one of the key organizations here in the establishment of internationalism. You can see they all have different interests. And if you've looked at my work, I've shown another picture of the inquiry with their backgrounds, their degrees, and all of that. So you can see William Bullitt. Some of you may know that name. He actually goes to Russia during the peace conferences with Lincoln Steffens to meet with Lenin. And they were highly successful. They came back super happy. This is what I hear. So they must have come to terms in some way. Okay, Mark Jefferson is one of those other names in cartography in America. Jefferson actually teaches Isaiah Bowman. If you've looked at the Bowman work that I've done, you can see that we show where and when and how. Okay, and you can see the information. Here we have David Hunter Miller. We'd mentioned him earlier. He's key technical advisor in international law. So he is a member of the inquiry. We've got pictures of him sitting with the inquiry in official inquiry photos. But here he's disconnected he is a technical advisor with information, though, going back and forth directly to the inquiry. And yes, for those asking, General Marlborough Churchill is directly related to Winston. Telephones, got to remember this is 1919. Telephones are, I suppose, very early in their development. Telegraph's still here very prominent. Okay, so that is the organizational chart of the American delegation. And where did that come from? But from this is the actual document coming out of James T. Shotwell's at the Paris Peace Conference. So you can see it's the same. They've just drawn it up so you can read it better. But I want to give you the primary source material as best as I can so you never trip yourself up, okay? Now this next chart, if we do have it here, is interesting. Here's some photos of the time there. This is them on the boat going over. I wonder if I can find. Is it there? Do we have one? There's one with the names on it. What I'd really like to see is the organizational chart for the entire conference itself. There's Bernard Brooke hanging out with Woodrow Wilson, Herbert Hoover. During these days. Okay, so one of the important things I want to show you is this organizational chart from Paris that shows the entire organization. May have to go look in here. Give me one moment, see what I can find. Success. Okay, so let me share this. This will be a profound, if you're visual, you're going to love this because this really shows you how history is told by the victors. This is the preliminary Allied organization to secure unity of aim protocol, organization, and working of the Paris Peace Conference. This is also an artifact taken from James T. Shotwell's at the Paris Peace Conference. From the appendixes in the back, and some of those actually are missing these. And so I had to go looking. But on Haiti Trust, you should be able to go and look on their archives, and you can find these and collect them if you want for yourself. But you can see here clearly, if I get out of the way, that on this side we have the representatives of the Allied powers. You can see Great Britain here, Japan, Belgium, France, Italy, the United States. Permanent Allied organization to secure unity of aim. Interesting term. Liberalism would be that. Progressive liberalism specifically, because all of those men there are liberal progressives. They didn't invite anybody on the right. True story. This is why it failed, I think, in America when they brought it back. The United States didn't want to participate. Okay, so you can see that they've broken it all down, but there's one part missing here, is that those that were defeated, the representatives of the Central Powers, in especially Germany, weren't even invited. They were invited at the very last minute to sign the Treaty of Versailles. That was it. They had no part in the negotiations, even though we've now proven that the Brits started the war against Germany on false pretenses, and then the Americans involved themselves on false pretenses. The Germans were never allowed to even be there to negotiate. And of course, the Western world held the moral and intellectual high ground at this point, and everybody looked to Germany as a militaristic, warmongering country at this point. You know, they'd named the Kaiser Wilhelm the Beast of Berlin, and created all kinds of stories like they are today to get people all incited. Now, the media is insightful. INCITEFUL. So interesting, right? History is told by the victors in a picture. You can find that at James T. Shotwell's at the Paris Peace Conference. Take a look at this before we get into the story too. There's the international map of the world. This is a aspect that Isaiah Bowman was key in. We're going to get into this as we tell the story, but the mapping of everything south of the Rio Grande was the responsibility of Isaiah Bowman. 1907, 1909, 1911, I think, were the 3 trips that he took down to South America in this area where Machu Picchu is. And so he was there with surveying crews and teams, really documenting the geography, and came back. And out of that comes the Hispanic Map of the World project. And it's this wing of the greater international map of the world. And this is key to understand because it's internationalism, and it's you can see that it's you want another picture that tells you 1,000 words, or you want to see total information awareness or full spectrum dominance. The mapping of the world was one of the first steps that they had to take. So we're seeing the rudimentary steps. I mean, these guys are running into tribal South American tribes that have never seen white man, and wars ensue over rubber down here. As I've shown in a Standard Oil map that was gifted to the AGS, where they'd gone in here and figured out all the different dialects and the different types of tribes and how to communicate with them. And they would go fly over these guys and drop Molotov cocktails and start fires in their where they habitate. So this area here is where Machu Picchu is. This is where Isaiah Bowman was concentrating all of his work on behalf of the Yale Corp and Harvard Corp. Okay, this is really what the main mission of Harvard, Yale corporations is. This is why I call them the real life Indiana Jones, because if you go and watch that movie, that's exactly what Indiana Jones is. He's a Ivy League professor, and he meets up with the CIA or the OSS, and they give him a bunch of money to go find the Holy Grail. It's the basis of the whole movie. So off goes Indiana Jones with CIA or US intelligence money on behalf of the university to go find the covenant, the Ark of the Covenant. So, and then what does the US intelligence do with it when they get it? They lock it away into a big, vast warehouse where they hold all the secrets. So I think that's where we're going to start here. Some good background showing you sort of where it started or where it ended, sorry. And so now we're going to show you where this all began, this idea of internationalism. So we're going to be talking about some similar terms. We talk about internationalism. We're going to talk about universalism, universal constitution. Okay, and the idea of internationalism really is either driven by progress or the other way around. They're so synonymous. Internationalism, yeah, I would say that actually progress is the tool that they use to advance their vision of an international universal world. And so you have to think about the definitions of what an individual will be under a world like that. And so we'll get into some of the definitions, and we're going to start to explain in a deep way why the definition of liberalism has shifted in America. Because they weren't going to be able to put the classic liberal into the factories. They had to change him spiritually, mind, body, and soul. This is what the industrial relations is all about, the scientific management of people. And this idea goes all the way back to these guys. So the first guy we're going to introduce you to is Hugo Grotius. He's really considered the father of international law. And who we're talking about here, the one theme that we're going to see through all these tabs and introducing you to some of these names is they're all social contract theorists. They call themselves economists, theologians, humanists, but they're really, or philosophers, but they're really social contract theorists. They all have derived their own idea of the best way that society could be run. Sociologists, political scientists, but they're all social contract theorists. This is a key to understand. So Dobruska's universal constitution here, aligning with the creation of the UN in that it is exactly the same idea, just sort of under a different name. And we're going to get into the Royal Society. Okay. So Hugo Grotius, English school, and he believed in a society of the state, one society of states. So this is what we're seeing. What is the UN or the EU? But a society of states. It's an international umbrella over fake nationalism. So an capital N nationalism. So that is Hugo Grotius. I encourage you to go and look into him. I'm going to introduce you to a lot of people. We're not going to go deeply into their backgrounds. I just want you to see that there's a commonality. Talk about ways and means and how the ways and means are often argued by all of these different factions, but the ends are always the same, a future utopia which will be perfect. So amazingly, we've run into Rosicrucianism because this is really what is at the basis of Rosicrucianism. It's a spiritual and cultural movement influenced by esoteric Christianity and Hermeticism that arose in early modern Europe in the early 17th century, so 1600s. After the publication of several texts announcing to the world a new secret society, Rosicrucianism is symbolized by the Rose Cross or Rosy Cross. There have been several Rosicrucian organizations since the initial movement was founded, including the Order of the Golden and Rosy Cross, the Societas Rosicruciana in Anglia, and Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. So this is the Invisible College. When you hear the term Invisible College, these are the guys. This is the theory or the ideal that they're really pushing forward, is that they're going to perfect humanity. We're going to create a constitutional or universal knowledge, and we're going to have a future perfect society. So many were attracted to the promise of a universal reformation of mankind through a science built on esoteric truths of the ancient past, which, concealed from the average man, provide insight into nature, the physical universe, and the spiritual realm. So this is very similar to how, those that rule us have either a bachelor or a master's degree in the liberal arts, and that is exactly what it is. So it is some Rosicrucian manifestos that really influence society. And these manifestos end up embedding themselves into the culture there, into scientific texts, philosophical texts. See, now Rosicrucianism is really the spirit of our world at this point. And it is out of this that the Royal Society comes from. Okay, many of the members of this Rosicrucian group were at the founding of the Royal Society. Okay, so intellectual climate was ready to receive it. So this is this invisible college idea that they were going to be there, and they had to wait for the right time where society was ready for them to introduce themselves. Okay, and this is where Brandeis goes back to Prague when he's a young adolescent, just a tweener, I think. And he's put in touch with these Rosicrucian texts, but by the time that he's around, this is 200 and something years, 250 years after, these ideas of scientific exploration and the advancement of technology to better society was already well established. So I would say that Brandeis, for certain, 100% came into contact with these. Whether he read the actual primary documents or not, I'm not sure. I would lean definitely towards that, but I can't make that claim. But certainly, this would be what he was back there for. He spent a couple years there, and this would explain, having a base in this secret knowledge, that this would explain why Brandeis blew the doors off of Harvard when he showed up, had the highest grade scores ever, and they lasted for 80 years. Louis Brandeis' entire life, he enjoyed that bragging right. Okay, so the Royal Society is founded in this milieu. So this will start to explain a lot for people. The Royal Society, formerly the Royal Society of London for Improving Natural Knowledge, is a learned society in the United Kingdom's National Academy of Sciences. So much like Fabianism has permeated into British culture through the Labour Party, Rosicrucianism has permeated through our world and British life, primarily through the creation of the Royal Society. And we see many people today, those that are the engineers of our society, are Royal Society members. Perhaps even Elon Musk, I'm not sure. So the Invisible College, okay, so this is from the pages of Royal Society wiki page. The Invisible College has been described as a precursor group to the Royal Society of London, consisting of a number of natural philosophers around Robert Boyle. The concept of invisible college is mentioned in German Rosicrucian pamphlets in the early 17th century. Ben Jonson in England referenced the idea related in meeting to Francis Bacon's House of Solomon in a masque, the fortunate isles of their union. The term accrued currency in the exchanges of correspondence with the Republic of Letters. So the Royal Society started from groups of physicians and natural philosophers meeting at a variety of locations, including Gresham College in London. A lot of these meetings that you're going to see, even of socialists and Marxists, they're all meeting in London. This is just like the Inter-Allied Socialist and Labor conferences, London and Paris. You'd think that they were having these socialist conferences in Russia or a socialist country, but that's not the case. The leading socialists at this point are British. Ethical socialist movement led by the Fabians, Sidney and Beatrice Webb. Sidney Webb is the chair, and we'll get into that. Okay, so they're showing that Francis Bacon and his New Atlantis was inspiration. A group known as Philosophical Society of Oxford was run by John Wilkins, warden of Wadham College. See, Bodleian. And these guys are key in establishing science as governance, or displacing God as the former authority, and now science is being placed there. We see here November 28th, 1660, which is considered the official foundation date of the Royal Society. A meeting at Gresham College of 12 natural philosophers decided to commence a college for the promoting of physical, mathematical, experimental learning. Those among those founders were Christopher Wren, Robert Boyle, John Wilkins, William Brunker, Robert Murray. These are all incredibly important historical figures to understand. I don't want to go too deep here, but I invite you to go. We don't want to get too sidetracked, but these are all key names. You want to stay on internationalism here. I don't want to get too distracted. It's going to be a deep show. So Rosicrucianism has a connection to Moses Dobruska, and this is where we're going to start this long road to the United Nations and the establishment of internationalism. And for many of you, you're probably familiar with Moses Dobruska now. If you've been following this work, I think I've probably talked about it. I haven't put anything out officially until now, but this is sort of the cutting edge of our research. And it's Moses Dobruska, aka Junius Frey, aka Franz Thomas Edler von Schonfeld. He's a Freemason. He's a member of the Illuminati. He's a Jacobin. He's hanging out with Jesuits. But most importantly, he's a Frankist. He's the second cousin to Jacob Frank. Now, this idea of Bohemia, Prague, this area that these guys all come from is so key to understanding internationalism, because even prior to the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, we have Prague, and we have under Rudolf II, this conglomeration of these philosophers and these scientific thinkers and these social contract theorists and these masters of Jewish mysticism. And he gets them all together in Prague under state sponsorship. He protects them, because prior to this, if you were to investigate any of that, you'd be labeled a heretic and burnt. But it's in Prague where he uses state sponsorship to protect them against external threats. And he allows them to expand and extrapolate all of their ideas and combine their ideas. And so this is very much like the Macy conferences of the 1940s and 50s, this interdisciplinary gathering of specialists to then come out with a comprehensive theory of social control. So we're just seeing now that the Macy conferences really are just following prior examples, and they're pushing the same stuff. So Dobruska was a writer, poet, and revolutionary. His mother was the first cousin of Jacob Frank, who claimed to be the Jewish Messiah and founded the Frankist sect. This is Jewish mysticism we are finding at the very origins of this international move. So December 1775, he converted to Judaism, to the Catholic faith, and took the name of Franz Thomas Schonfeld. You see this with all of these guys. They actually, Frank, even Sabbatai Zevi, they all convert. And we think that the history is that they convert because they have to submit, but what they are doing is they're converting to infiltrate. It's a different perspective. You can see here he's involved in the Masonic Lodge, the Knights of St. John the Evangelists for Asia and Europe, 1783, 1790s, 1792. In the wake of the French Revolution, he traveled via Strasbourg to Paris and became a Jacobin, changing his name once again to Junius Frey. The new name derived from Junius, from the Roman Juni family that fostered the famous tyrant slayer Brutus, and Frey being a transliteration of the German word for liberty. He published his book, Philosophie Sociale. I think that says First in France, the people of France, dedicated people of France. He was arrested for treason and espionage and executed by guillotine, 1794, 3 years after Jacob Frank dies, 3 years after the first ever World's Fair, which happens in Prague. And we're going to get into that too. Because the World's Fair, what is it? But it's this international competition of technological and industrial advancement. Progress. So this idea of progress has never really been a traditional thought of humanity up until Prague, just prior to the Enlightenment period. This may be the inspiration for all of it, including the French revolutions. We just haven't been able to get there. So this is why I'm saying maybe. I can't definitively say that, although we're definitely headed in that direction. Okay, so we're going to get into his book, Moses Dobruska, because, like I said, this is really the foundational moments of internationalism. You can see here, showing that he's a order of the Illuminati. You know, Jacob Frank, many historians, including Robert Sepper, as far as you want to trust him, state that Schonfeld Frank is a founder of the Illuminati along with Rothschild and Weishaupt. So either way, when you trace the Illuminati and this Frankist Sabbatean sect, we end up in this same region of Bohemia, and even sort of larger in Prussia, but very centralized, very close, within 100 or 200 miles of each other. And this is where Hollywood comes from, same spot. Okay. So let's get into Dobruska. There is really no picture of him. I haven't been able to uncover any pictures of him, but we'll get into his book, because there is a researcher out here now sort of breaking this news. And this is how we find a lot of our information, is through these. I think this would have been a dissertation of hers. And it's an investigation into the life of Moses Dobruska, because she's felt that he's been highly underrated in his involvement in the creation of the social sciences. Okay. So I think you guys should be looking at a... No, you're not looking. You're still looking at Dobruska. Give me 1 sec. And I'll just take this one and we'll go back to the cover. So there you go. Why this is so small. We're going to need to get close here, so we'll just expand this. I don't want to have everybody squinting their eyes. So let's go back to the beginning, introduce you from the cover here. And we'll go through some key spots just to establish this idea of universal constitution that Dobruska proposes, and the similarities between the ideology or the doctrine to the UN and this idea of internationalism. Okay, so Silvana Greco is the woman She's I'm not sure what she is. She's got to be some sort of professor. And I believe she's in Europe. Her accent's pretty deep. She's probably Czechoslovakian or Czechia. But this book, very important to our history, okay? So Moses Dobruska and the Invention of Social Philosophy, Utopia, Judaism, and Heresy under the French Revolution. So social philosophy and social science and social justice all very connected here. This is really a motivating or a tool that they use to move society forward. Okay, so we'll start at page 14. States there Masonic activity. Same thing we're seeing at the wiki page. The Philosophie Sociale develops a highly articulated way of thinking about social reality, about the understanding of human beings who live in a society and interact with their fellow human beings, and about their needs and ambitions. The ultimate aspiration of human beings is, according to Dobruska, the achievement of happiness. So when we hear this term, life, liberty, and happiness, and the pursuit of happiness, that's Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson's alive during the French revolutions. I mean, when you think about it, America, 1776, and the French revolutions are nearly at the same time. And what you see coming up in the United States as this new world experiment is this new version of liberalism called classic liberalism, the rugged individual, the right to speak and think freely and assemble as they wish. And we also have in France at this time this type of liberalism invented by Dobruska that's based on social science, sociological information, the use of stats and facts. And this is really the liberalism that overthrows the French Revolution. So you have this parallel rising of liberalism, and what you see in America is that this progressive, radical reform liberalism now has completely redefined what liberalism is in America. You can clearly see that. It's been happening for over 100 years. And the founding, this straying away from the classic liberals started in the early 20th century in the progressive era. And Louis Brandeis is one of the key guys. Okay, so I hope that helps you gives you a sort of grander look. But so we see he's calling for the achievement of happiness. You know, John Locke talks about life, liberty, and property. And then Thomas Jefferson comes along and says life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Out the window goes property. Out the window goes the most powerful form or force that a rugged individual could have is personal property, whether that's knowledge, tools, land, right? So property goes out the window. And here we are in the year 2026, 4 years from 2030, where the World Economic Forum had said, what? You will own nothing and be happy. So Dobruska here, near the bottom of this paragraph here, is convinced that if legislation is based on these principles and applied in accordance with them, the new social structure will finally overcome the sufferings and distortions of the past and move towards coveted happiness. I mean, that could be Woodrow Wilson. That sounds straight out of The New Freedom. We've taken, if not verbatim, new social structure right out of The New Freedom. We've shown you in the last show. It's really drenched in this kind of talk. New Constitution, new Declaration of Independence, new social order. So the parallels here, we see history repeating. And it really all starts here with Philosophie Sociale and this Moses Dobruska character, second cousin to Jacob Frank. So he's talking about two parts to this US or this universal constitution. Am I in the right spot? Yes, yes, yes. Okay, I skipped over that. So here is the most important part for us to understand. In this middle paragraph here, the text is a theoretical elaboration through which our author distills 70 principles or laws of cause and effect. Okay, cause and effect on which to base the first part of the US Constitution. These principles represent the social philosophical basis for the body of rules in which the new democratic society, which is to be born from the ashes of the absolute monarchy, will have to stand. The second part of the universal constitution will be the application of these principles by the people, i.e., by the elected representatives in assemblies, as well as by the legislative power. Dobruska is convinced that if legislation is based on these principles and applied in accordance with them, the new social structure will finally overcome the sufferings and distortion of the past and move towards coveted happiness. So, two parts to this universal constitution that Dobruska proposes. One, cause and effect. Second, the application through legislation. What does that sound like? That is Norbert Wiener's feedback loop. That is social science and applied science. Social science research is the Brandeis brief writ large, the collection of stats and data to then apply back into society to direct them in the way that you want. So here we see the grand concept aligning exactly with our modern day of social sciences. And this is why this guy is now considered the founder of social sciences or sociology, sort of upstream from Auguste Comte and Henri de Saint-Simon and all of these mid-18th century social contract theorists, or what Henri de Saint-Simon was an ethical socialist. And out of this line comes the ethical socialism of the Fabians at the turn of the 19th century and into the 20th century. So you can see there's a commonality here that is undeniable. I hope you guys are picking up what I'm saying. Social science is the collection of information, stats, data, facts on society, like a census. And then they use that information and they crunch those numbers and they figure out how best to use that. And then they apply it back into society to steer them. And we are seeing a progressive, radical revolution going on in the streets of Minneapolis, and they're all largely captivated by mainstream black magic. And maybe we'll get into that a little more as we go. I can show you examples of these things, but this is really the liberalism that comes over from the French Revolution. All of these people today that are out there crying about fascism are actually the causes of it. And it is this radical progressive liberalism that they espouse. They may even call themselves a Democrat or a lefty, but really, with the application of radical social reform, this is where this new term of progressive liberalism comes from. Yet you'll see that they only use the term liberal or liberalism, as if the classic liberal has completely disappeared, much like they'll say anti-Semitism, despite there being 77 branches of Semitic-speaking people. They're staking claim to the entire tree, removing the Arab from the definition of what it is to be a Semite as much as they are removing them from the geographical location. Palestine. We've, of course, gotten into that deeply. Okay, so we've gone through the Royal Society, the Rosicrucian manifestos. This, if you look into the back pages of history, you'll see that this is really the founding of internationalism, and it coincides with the rise of scientific expertise, the development of industrial technology. Okay, and see here some references to Sabbatai Zevi. This is really the same stream that Jacob Frank falls into. These Jewish mystic messiahs. Okay, and it's far more prevalent in our world today than you would suspect. Okay, so our next page on Dobruska is the next one. 34. think we just showed this actually. It shows here that he's a member of the Illuminati or the Jesuits. He's hanging out with the Jesuits on this page. Yeah, Maria Theresa and Jesuit Dennis Xavier Clement. So there's this milieu that's these guys are in that pretty much has everybody. So if you ever seen the Godfather movie where they bring all the gangsters together and they sit around a table, this is really what we see here, much like the Paris Peace Conference. 170, 180 years later after this. Okay. We're just going through this book showing the connections, and this is reputable research, really mainstream. You can see that the mainstream historians are coming around, and this is what they're talking about. So Freemason in Vienna, this is talking about Dobruska's time in Vienna, and this is important to understand because the Vienna revolutions are led really by Joseph Goldmark and the Wiles, Whehle. And these are direct relatives of the first Jewish U.S. Supreme Court Justice, Louis Dembitz Brandeis. So the social rise of Dobruska and his inclusion in the elitist circles of Imperial Vienna was certainly helped by his commitment to Freemasonry, which he entered while he was still young, probably immediately after his conversion to Catholicism. Maria Theresa had initially opposed the Masonic phenomenon and had forced the closure of the Vienna Lodge in 1745. In the following decades, however, Freemasonry had gradually gained influence and established itself as an important social and cultural factor. In 1781, the Bavarian nobleman Hans Heinrich von Ecker and Eckhofen founded the Order of the Asian Brothers, and Dobruska played an important role in shaping its Kabbalistic esoteric background. So we talk about the Kabbalah being an essential part of Freemasonry. This may be the moment that it was infused. And this guy's inspiring the French revolutions. He's created our social science, all in the name of happiness. You can start to see how the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Happiness may not be the most important thing that we should be chasing. Pleasure should not necessarily be our primary focus. Purpose and meaning should be, as far as I can tell, and this has been proven observably, repeatedly in my own life. So having a meaning and purpose, very important. And this is also what they say, that meaning and purpose motivates human beings. And so they give us a meaning and purpose. But the truth of those meanings and purposes, protesting on grounds of morality, when you can't find morality in politics, it's just these guys are deeply uneducated. And they're being steered like pinballs. And it's probably best that we understand the history so we don't allow that to happen to ourselves, okay? So this is really why I do this work. I want everybody to understand the history. So page 42 is our next one. This goes into sort of some of the philosophies here as well. So the Philosophie Sociale of 1793, a new thought. So in this second chapter, I will delve into the Philosophie Sociale, on which Moses Dobruska began to work feverishly in Paris towards the end of 1792. In all likelihood, Dobruska wrote the first version of the opus in German. Of that, only a few sheets remain. And those were among the papers seized from the author at the time of his arrest in November 1793. And were then deposited at the Archives Nationales in Paris. Would I not love to go check that out? So the German text, which I am publishing for the first time here in the appendix, and which I will quote where the pages are available, although limited to a small part of the work, is very significant. It shows us how Dobruska was deeply immersed in the German culture of his time and how the Philosophie Sociale, composed in France and so closely linked to French politics and the revolution, has a fundamental German intellectual component. Now, one of the things that we got to understand about all of these philosophical thinkers, these social contract theorists, they're all close with leaders. They have technology and they have a way of thinking and philosophizing about society that puts them within direct contact of these kings and queens and leaders of society. Presidents, prime ministers now, right? This idea of cameralism surrounding leaders with scientific expertise. Same time. See, enlightened absolutists, same time, late 1700s, in Sweden and Prussia. So here she's saying that he has deep influence in the French Revolution. First and foremost, the title deserves our attention. Although he is not the inventor of the expression social philosophy, Dobruska certainly had a good claim to be considered the first great promoter of the union between philosophy, the symbol of enlightenment, and the social sphere. As I already mentioned, Jean-Baptiste Duressoy, a Jesuit from Belfort in Bourgogne-Franche-Comté, had already published a work entitled Philosophie Sociale. You can see the Jesuits are hard at work too, trying to figure out how to best control society. And what is it? It's the perfectibility of man. And who are the first perfectibilists but the Illuminati? So finally, the last function of the Universal Constitution is to avoid social disorganization and the reemergence of tyrants or the reaffirmation of a monarchic regime. As we have seen, if the legislator, under the strict control of the people, meticulously applies the principles of the first part of the Constitution, abuse of power and rebellion can be avoided. In this way, the stability of the social order is not endangered. This is really the basis of it. They want a solid, dependable, reliable base of social order so that it actually doesn't get disrupted and they can continue off into eternity in control of, in this case, the entire world. So the purpose of the Universal Constitution is the happiness of citizens and society as a whole. This is ringing Jeremy Bentham's utilitarianism and the greater good. He's also the inventor of the panopticon and the penitentiary and the insane asylum. It is now necessary to focus on the principles that follow from this. The starting point in such a discussion can only be a definition of the human being. Dobruska questions the nature, the aspirations, the desires, the needs of the human being, whom he calls the new sovereign, both in the state of nature and in the state of culture that is in society. The first general definition from which the Philosophie Sociale starts is that of être homme, to be man. That is to say, of a human being. The direct translation there is être is the verb to be, and homme is man. In fact, the human being must be understood as a living being whose instinct is susceptible to the widest development and the greatest perfection. Dobruska goes on to say that this definition presents us with man in all his scope, from the cradle of brute instinct to, so to speak, to the highest degree of his culture and his virility. It is an anthropological vision. Anthropology is a social science which endows man with knowledge, virtue, and happiness in the same way as error, vice, and unhappiness. In addition to having the greatest faculties to evolve, improve, and reach the highest degree of perfection in the most diverse areas of intellectual, moral, and material life, man is also capable of harmful and destructive actions. So that's page 88. Next page, we talk about perfectibility and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And what did Jean-Jacques Rousseau write? But The Social Contract, probably the most famous social contract theorist. And we see Enlightenment thinkers of the time, which emphasize the concept of man's perfectibility. Although there is not complete unanimity among scholars, the term perfectibility is generally attributed to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whose writings were well known to Dobruska. It is in his second speech to the Academy of Dijon on the origin of foundations of inequalities, written in 1754, that Rousseau sets out his idea of the perfectibility of man in the civil state compared to man in the natural or primitive state. Rousseau reminds us that the difference between man and animal lies in a specific faculty of the former, that of perfecting oneself, more precisely the Genevan philosopher states. Geneva is a key international city, isn't it? To this day. However, even if the difficulties attending all these questions should still leave room for difference in this respect between men and brutes, there is another very specific quality which distinguishes them and which will admit of no dispute. This is the faculty of self-improvement, which by the help of circumstances gradually develops all the rest of our faculties and is inherent in a species as in the individual, whereas a brute is, at the end of a few months, all he will ever be during his whole life, and his species at the end of 1,000 years, exactly what it was the first year of that 1,000. Why is man alone liable to grow into a dotard? Not sure what that is. Am I supposed to be offended? It's not because he returns in this to his primitive state, and that while the brute, which has acquired nothing and has therefore nothing to lose, still retains the force of instinct. Man who loses by age or accident all that his perfectibility has enabled him to gain falls by this means lower than the brutes themselves. So we're seeing this perfectibility of man. This is really the idea behind all of these secret societies, except it's a faux interest in that they took out the education from our common schools that would have enabled us far easier to be perfecting ourselves. Grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, music, astronomy, and geometry. These are where we open ourselves up to the origins of society or the origins of humanity. We start to answer a lot of questions for ourselves through those 7 liberal arts, but they removed them. So it's disingenuous to say that they were trying to perfect the individual, because here we are 200 years later, social science and the research university dominates. Have we gotten closer to perfectibility or further away? Where are we when in terms of natural law, true sovereignty? Where's the rugged individual today? We got a nation of beta males running around screeching about fascism when they're the ones that founded it. 1917, the Principles of Scientific Management, there is a fasces on it. As we've shown. Okay, so a little bit more on Dobruska, and then we're going to get into this rise of internationalism. As we pull it forward out of the 1700s and 1800s, we're going to start to show you all the key names that link, and it's quite amazing, to say the least. So 135, certainly go and look at this book. It is at internetarchive.org. You can go and read it for yourself. I guess it's right here. Put the wrong number. So a final meaning of the term happiness theorized in the Philosophie Sociale is what we could define as sociological happiness. I propose this definition based on the philosophical happiness of which Mauzy speaks in the 18th century. The reference is to the science of happiness of which the age of enlightenment is in search, starting from the knowledge of human nature and of the laws of feeling. Rather than senses, the 5 senses critical to our understanding that feeds our gut instinct. Nothing more important to the human being than your gut instinct, yet if you listen to the mainstream, they'll diminish the importance of that all day long, any chance they get. That is really the secret. It's combining your 5 senses into a gut instinct through a deductive logical process, grammar, logic, rhetoric. This is the classic education that they removed, and there's a reason why. And so I actually went and grabbed the Trivium, started reading it over 10 years ago, and have applied a lot of those principles into my life, and it's been very successful. So I encourage you to go find that book and start reading it, especially that first page and page 9 on logical fallacies. If your children and your life are important to you, and you do not like to be lied to, and you do not want your children to be lied to after you're gone. Chapter 9 in the Trivium, Sister Miriam Joseph talks about logical fallacy. Did you know that there's names for all of the lies? This was profound for me, that there's categories and all types. There's names for all of them. Ad hominem, argumentum ad hominem, right? The bandwagon fallacy, just because everybody believes it to be true doesn't make it true. These are the basis of our terms and concepts of knowledge. You cannot argue these. So Dobruska does not pursue a philosophical happiness starting with universal man. His objective is instead a sociological happiness, which is about being social. The Philosophie Sociale investigates the social, cultural, and political conditions that allow or prevent the achievement of happiness in society. This is at the same time that Thomas Jefferson's talking about life, liberty, and happiness, no? And he's a huge fan of the French Revolution, by the way. So in conclusion, we can say that for Dobruska, happiness is not an unreachable chimera, but a condition within the reach of many, thanks to the support of society and ultimately social science, the scientific development of happiness. Okay. I'm going to show you the next page. Sort of who Dobruska influenced. So as I will show in the following, it is clear that social theorists of great importance, first among them Henri de Saint-Simon and Auguste Comte, read the Philosophie Sociale and drew inspiration from it. However, they carefully avoided publicly expressing their debt to a foreigner, a subject of the Austrian Empire, suspected of espionage, and, as if that were not enough, a converted Jew. Moses Dobruska and his extraordinary biographical adventure was brought to light in 1979-1981 by the great Gershom Scholem, scholar of Jewish mysticism, probably the authority on it, who was born in Berlin and subsequently emigrated to Israel. Scholem's study, originally published in French, reevaluated Dobruska's esoteric interests, Masonic commitment, and adventurer's attitude, but almost completely overlooked the intellectual significance of Philosophie Sociale. So I'm not sure if Gershom Scholem is serving as a gatekeeper here or not, but we are getting to the bottom of it either way. So the Jacobin parliamentarian Francois Chabot, who was Moses Dobruska's political patron, married his sister Leopoldine and shared his misfortune, ending up on the gallows on the same day. Chabot seems to be one of the first to read the draft of Philosophie Sociale. And what I want to show here finally, and we'll move on, is the influence that he had on Auguste Comte and Henri de Saint-Simon. So beyond work and life, through researching sources which had not yet been carried out and which I had the opportunity to accomplish for this study, it appears that the biographical path of Henri de Saint-Simon and that of Dobruska have crossed, albeit in rather unusual circumstances. The background to their meeting was not in fact the silence of a library or the worldly atmosphere of a living room, but the most unpleasant experience of the Parisian prison of Saint Pelagie. So here he goes into, or she goes into talking about how Henri de Saint-Simon is in prison with the Frey brothers. So that is Dobruska and his brothers are in prison and they meet Henri de Saint-Simon. So they are contemporaries like Saint-Simon and Comte. So they are in the same eras. And Dobruska does predate these guys. And certainly when you look at the work of both Henri de Saint-Simon and Comte, the general essence, the total philosophical ideas, the ideology, and the ways and means in which they go are directly attributed to Dobruska. Okay, and then this idea of deconstruction and reconstruction of society is what they came up with. And so where Jean-Jacques Rousseau wanted to create revolution and overthrow monarchies, he may not have had a solution at the other end as to what society was going to look like. And this is really the role in which Dobruska fills. He comes up with this post-revolutionary society. It's going to be controlled by scientific governance. So from Dobruska to Saint-Simon and from there to Comte, a biographical thread links the three characters in a continuous way. If the first two met in the narrow space of the Parisian prison, the personal ties between Saint-Simon and Comte are well known and are documented since August 1817, when the young Comte becomes secretary of the older and already famous Saint-Simon. It is an intellectual bond with important consequences, Comte will write. From this relationship, I have received a great number of things that I would have searched in vain for in books. Okay, so we're going to start to see, hopefully, a raising in awareness of Dobruska as the founder of social science. Problem with that is it starts to open up the doors and people start to see the Frankist background, this antinomian push to throw out all tradition and value. So Rousseau, negative critique, delegitimizing the ancient regime, this former system of monarchic rule. And Dobruska builds a new society based on this social constitution, this new universal constitution. This is really what establishes the French Revolution and all the turmoil and chaos of the other revolutions in Europe in 1848. We see the French Revolution and the European Revolution separated by about 50 years, but there's this whole time it's chaos. And we see in the 1848s direct relatives of the first Jewish U.S. Supreme Court justice involved as leaders in the French Revolution. Okay, so where to now? We'll start moving our way towards the latter half of the 18th century. We're going to get into these other figures that are prominent. If I can get there. See if I can find it. Maybe I should show this actually too. Let's show this first. Show you Ukraine. Is that what you're looking at right now? You probably are. Let me just double check that. Yes. I don't know why these go small. I like them as big as I can. So, hotbed of Frankist activity from Gershom Scholem. We see, where are they fighting right now? What's been out in the news for the last 10 years? Ukraine. I'm just saying. And we're going to show that the Paris Peace Conference is where they reestablish all of these borders. It's the inquiry, the founders of the CFR that are redrawing all the maps. And on economic terms, transportation on the ocean, transportation lines, the Danube main line goes overland. The Berlin to Baghdad railway, these are all key aspects, and that's what makes this area important. I'm just saying that it's also a hotbed of Frankism. or was so in the day. Okay, so now we can get on with some of this later these later people. There it is. So Immanuel Kant is another one of these guys. You know, obviously an intellectual thinker. If you guys could see what's going on in the background. Okay, so Immanuel Kant, not sure if you're looking at it already, but obviously a social contract theorist. If you know anything about Immanuel Kant, and what is his idea of internationalism? His cosmopolitan reputation is called into question by his promulgation of scientific racism. And cosmopolitanism means the idea that all human beings are members of a single community. Its adherents are known as cosmopolitan or cosmopolite. Cosmopolitanism is both prescriptive and aspirational, believing humans can and should be world citizens in a universal community. So let's jump to the German historical school. And if you've gone into my work and the history on the German historical school, these are the guys that taught the first social science experts, right? So this social science degrees were only available in Germany at this time, 1800s. And so if you were to want that background, you'd have to travel to Germany to get it. This is the PhD system I've talked about. It's originating in Germany. It's not an American thing. But the first foreigners to receive a PhD were Americans. And who were they? Edward Everett, Granville Stanley Hall, founders of our Western education. And so who do they learn from? But these guys, these same guys. And so Edward Allsworth Ross, Albion Woodbury Small, I think George Howard. These are all the founders of the social science. We've already shown in Brandeis Part 6, the science of law, how they were working directly with 33rd degree Master Mason Nathan Roscoe Pound, the dean of Harvard Law School, to introduce social sciences. So they all went over, got their PhDs, and then they come back to America, much like the founders of the experimental psychological laboratories at U.S. institutions, U.S. universities. These men come back with this knowledge you can only get in Prussia to establish social sciences in America. Universities at that time were not research universities, but most of them are today. And this is why. This is directly why. So Franz Lieber, he's famous for creating the Lieber Code, was the military law that governed the wartime conduct of the Union Army by defining and describing command responsibility for war crimes and crimes against humanity and the military responsibilities of the Union soldier fighting in the American Civil War. So the General Orders number 100, instructions for the government of the armies of the United States in the field, were written by Franz Lieber, a German lawyer, political philosopher, and combat veteran of the Napoleonic Wars. And so this is really what it comes out of, is the Prussian Reformation. They really get their butt kicked by Napoleon. It at least this is the official story, exposes the weaknesses of Prussian government at that time. And so they overhaul everything. And it's in this atmosphere and environment that these founders of Western education come to observe how society has been developing under these ideas, and they go back and they pass it in Congress and they say, yep, this is our thing. And I can show you the actual papers. I have actually in some of our videos, I've shown the actual documents where Edward Everett and Horace Mann are talking about establishing the Prussian idea in first Massachusetts. And today, that first common school built in Massachusetts still stands, and it has a square and compass over the entrance door. You can see that Franz Lieber, this German historical school professor that you'd think would have stayed over in Germany, actually comes over 1869 and teaches political science and history at Columbia. Publicly lectured about the laws and usages of war, proposing that the laws of war correspond to a legitimate purpose for the war. Really, what inspires this international idea is the fact that war is brutal. We see, the Pope send a letter to all belligerents during the First World War claiming that we must end this material force of arms and replace it with an international force of diplomacy. Okay, another one of these German historical school guys that are key in the establishment of internationalism, Gustav Ratzenhofer, Austrian military officer, philosopher and sociologist, otherwise known as a social contract theorist. Here's another, Gustav von Schmoller, leader of the younger German historical school of economics. We've gone into that. Schmoller disavowed the socialist label, instead tracing his thoughts to the heterodox liberalism represented by, we see here, John Stuart Mill. And in his book, he talks about, if you read On Liberty, he talks explicitly about having one, if for his version of experimental liberalism is to succeed, they want one party of order and stability and another party of chaos and progress, change and progress. So this is why you see alternating presidents being elected, because they need to flip it so that they can use each of these parties against each other under hostile banners, is what John Stuart Mill says, to then push society forward from the chaos. So you want to talk ordo ab chaos that's on our dollar bill? It comes from John Stuart Mill, one of the founders of liberalism. Now, all of those progressives that are out there protesting in Minneapolis, do you think that they could name even one founder of liberalism? I have often asked them to define liberalism or to provide a name of a founder of liberalism, and they cannot. They will basically say that liberalism is open-mindedness, and now that is a very slippery slope, is it not? And we're starting to see how we can be exploited through our vulnerabilities. Blissful ignorance, this dependence on the scientific expert, has created a nation of narcissists bent on this false idea of morality. They're being directed largely by provocateurs, and this goes back throughout history as a tactic that we've seen over and over and over and over. Okay, so Johann Caspar Blümchen, another very key figure in this long march towards the United Nations. He's here in the 18th or 19th century. So Swiss jurist and politician, and together with fellow liberals, Franz Lieber and Edouard René de Laboulaye, developed one of the first codes of international law and war. Okay. So a major part of this long road to the UN is this First International. You can see here the delegates at the Geneva Congress at the First International. Now, Geneva itself is a huge name in this idea of internationalism, only probably preceded by the Hague. This is the first meetings of these First International, and it's largely socialist Marxists, and it's not state-sponsored. So much like Rudolph II harbored all of these intellectuals and protected them, we see that the First International specifically is very important in that it shows that they can actually operate outside of state control. and this idea of internationalism, because ultimately it is going to take down nations. And to be organizing meetings inside that nation of which you're going to take down would be highly detrimental to your survival or your health if the nation knew of it. But I think here we're seeing that they're able to operate, meet. We talk about the two forms of propaganda. They've already got this place to congregate, and from out of this First International comes all kinds of information, periodicals, journals. And Marx is here as a journalist. The First International and Karl Marx are pretty much synonymous. And we see a famous break in these ideas, this idea of a future perfect. And one of the best examples of this is at the First International. So there's a picture of Karl Marx. Pierre Joseph Proudhon, one of the main figures in anarchy. Mikhail Bakunin. He's the guy, I think, that meets Trotsky when Trotsky lands in New York. Trotsky works out of the New York Public Library, leaves to get to Russia, 1917, about 4 months before Walter Lippmann starts working at the New York Public Library in creation of the Council on Foreign Relations. So anybody wants to investigate that and see if there's direct connections between Trotsky and these progressives, that would be foundational. Okay, so here's a picture of them, the delegates at the 1869 Basel Congress. And what I'm just trying to show you here, I'm gonna break out of these pictures and show you that there's a long line here of meetings. And so this has taken decades and decades and decades of maneuvering politically, of persuading the right people, in creating these meetings and establishing the idea of internationalism, and finally usurping the idea of a nation state. So you can see the idea of international working class solidarity was a product of the development of capitalism in the 19th century, which created a global market and a global proletariat with common interests. Now, that's dubious to me, because so many people blame capitalism, but it's, that is laissez-faire. So much like they removed us from natural law with civil rights, they removed us from our own ability to create our own market, laissez-faire, by calling it capitalism and then monopolizing it, Morganizing it to the point where we're almost fully centralized in nearly every field, every corporation, whether you want to talk food, water, any of it, money, finance. We got 4 banks in America now, where there was 23,000 at the turn of the 20th century. So early socialist and communist thinkers, from Robert Owen to Karl Marx, viewed socialism as an international project. The first concrete attempts to form international workers as organizations emerged in the 1830s and 1840s among political exiles in Paris, such as the German Communist League, for whom Marx and Friedrich Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto. That's 1848. And one thing, before we go any further, we're going to talk about Marx. I want to refer you back to the Davos speech that Carney had spoke. And he opens really that speech by, I don't know how many people know this, by quoting the final words of the Communist Manifesto: "Working men of all countries unite." And he talked about how shop owners would hold that sign up in support of the international workers of the world. And he allegorically tells this story of how it's time now to take that sign down, the support of the international workers of the world. So I'll leave that to you to define what that exactly means, but it doesn't sound good for the rugged individual. As we now step into algorithmic law rather than administrative. Okay, so you can see here, they're directly linking Marx with this whole idea of internationalism, and Robert Owen, who is an ethical socialist, and in the same times, I believe, is Henri de Saint-Simon. Yeah, and these guys are socialists at their very core. And these are the kinds of new moral worlds that they're proposing. So they're drawing up diagrams. They're social science or social contract theorists. And Robert Owen is one of the more famous ones. So these are the things that they're creating. You can see their new moral world. Maybe we should click on that and see what they say. The New Moral World was an early socialist newspaper in the United Kingdom, once the national official publication of Owenism. The publication was launched by Robert Owen in November 1834 as the successor to Crisis, and carried the subtitle, A London Weekly Publication Developing the Principles of the Rational System of Society. Okay. Moral, new world. All three words there combined, very interesting. So that's Robert Owen. He's one of these ethical socialists, along with Henri de Saint-Simon. And if you've read The Fabian Freeway, or you know this history, you know that Fabian ethical socialism, or the Fabian society movement, that's now the labor movement, is directly in this same lineage. The Fabians proudly called themselves ethical socialists and had no problem being associated with Henri de Saint-Simon or Robert Owen. Okay, then we get to the Second International, and this is, I think, where a break between all of these guys happen. So there's a big argument over ways and means. I invite you to go in there and start researching this and figuring it out. But the main idea here is that there's a break in how they want to approach us, the ways and means towards this utopia. And on one side, we have Karl Marx, and on the other, I think it is Bakunin. But here, I'm not well informed on the details of this. I will be at some point, because obviously it's worth looking into. But what we need to just understand here is that Marx is a critical influence on these First and Second Internationals and the general idea of a universal world. I can't say constitution because he didn't want constitutions. He didn't want nationalism. This is what unites these internationalists with Marx. And they've taken and left parts of what Marx wrote and Engels wrote. But in general, the ideology there that came out of the Paris Peace Conference sounds a lot like Karl Marx. So you just see that there's an alignment here with some amazing figures. That's really what we're trying to establish here, this idea of internationalism. I better show. This. Let's go back to the First International. So internationalism, we see a picture of Karl Marx here. International Working Men's Association, or First International, was an organization founded in 1864, composed of various working class radicals and trade unionists who promoted an ideology of internationalist socialism and anti-imperialism. Figures such as Karl Marx and anarchist revolutionary Mikhail Bakunin would play prominent roles in the First International. The inaugural address of the First International, written by Marx in October 1864 and distributed as a pamphlet, contained calls for international cooperation between working people and condemnations of the imperialist policies of national aggression undertaken by the governments of Europe. So you can see if he's aligning with the British on this idea of universalism, he's certainly not aligning with them on the idea of imperialism. So you can see that they are united in where they want to go and where they want to end up, but obviously nearly opposites in the ways that they want to get there. Okay, so that's important to understand. Yeah, so I want to show, before we go any further, how many meetings there actually were. I'm not sure. Can I go to the First International here somewhere? hope you guys are following along. It looks like it is. So I'll just go down here and show you the list of meetings and where they are. You can see the congresses and conferences that took place that link all of these First International and Second International, and then the later conferences in Basel and the Hague. Okay, you can see that they go through 1864, 1865, all the way into late 1870s. And this is where the Second International starts, 1880s. Giuseppe Mazzini, sorry. Who was he? An Italian politician, journalist, and activist for the unification of Italy, spearhead of the Italian revolutionary movement, an Italian nationalist. Mazzini here in the second paragraph, his thoughts influenced the Italian and European Republican movements, the Constitution of Italy, and Europeanism, as well as politicians of a later period, including fascist dictator Benito Mussolini, American President Woodrow Wilson, British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, Indian independence movement figures Mahatma Gandhi, and Jawaharlal Nehru, creator of Hindutva ideology, and former president of China, Sun Yat-sen. So what is Europeanism? Are the norms and values that Europeans are said to have in common and which transcend national or state identities. In addition to helping promote European integration, this doctrine also provides the basis for analysis that characterized European politics, economics, and society as reflecting a shared identity. It is often associated with human rights, electoral democracy, and rule of law, starting to sound a lot like the European Union. So the phase of European values arises as a political neologism in the 1980s in the context of the project of European integration and the future formation of the European Union. So you can see that, and this is what we're starting to see with the TechNate, is that this is just going to be an EU here. The national idea is going to stay and remain. The flags will stay, and we'll all think that we're Canadians and Americans, but really we're being ruled by this supra-state that James T. Shotwell warned us about at the Paris Peace Conference. He said in the establishment of this ILO and the League of Nations, we run the risk of creating a supra-state, a one world government. So whether he knew or not he was playing dumb, I don't know. Here's our guy, Henri de Saint-Simon. You can see his nose there. For whatever reason, Silvana Greco put that picture when talking about Dobruska, but this is most certainly Henri de Saint-Simon, a portrait from the first quarter of the 19th century by Godefroy Engelmann. We've gone deep into Henri de Saint-Simon. I don't think we need to really emphasize anymore. He's definitely being influenced by Dobruska. It's a French political, economic, and socialist theorist, not a social theorist, and businessman whose thought had a substantial influence on politics, economics, sociology, and the philosophy of science. He was a younger relative of the famous memoirist, the Duc de Saint-Simon. So I encourage you to go look. You'll see the same parallels that I'm exposing here. And now we'll get into more modern days. We're going to get into the turn of the 20th century as we head closer to the finale of this long road to internationalism and this podcast. We have Stephen Pierce Hayden Duggan. He's considered the apostle of internationalism. Here's a picture of him. You're not going to find many pictures of this guy either. Barely has a wiki page, but that is the apostle of internationalism. He is in there with the founding of the CFR, deeply involved in the philosophical and intellectual building of the architectural basis and foundations of all of this. So, born in New York City, died in Connecticut. It's a United States scholar. So where did he go to school? But CCNY, Columbia University. And he's the founder of the Institute of International Education, together with Nobel laureates Elihu Root and Nicholas Murray Butler, and was the first director until 1946. He was the director at the same time, apparently, of the Council on Foreign Relations for 4 years or more. No, it would have been way more. The entire time almost. He was, this is why they call him the Apostle of Internationalism, I suppose. He's the director of both the Institute of International Education and the Council on Foreign Relations at the same time. Nicholas Murray Butler, previously mentioned there as one of the founders of the international, whatever we just said there. Doesn't state it here. Oops. The Institute of International Education, founded also by Nicholas Murray Butler. Who is he? He's an American philosopher, diplomat, and educator. Diplomat usually means intelligence agent. Butler was president of Columbia University, president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize. And he was a running mate of William Howard Taft in that famous 1912 election. One of these underrated figures in our creation of internationalism, like H.G. Wells. So he earned his bachelor's degree in 1882, his master's degree in 1883. So he's fully armed, and his doctorate in 1884. So he's got a bachelor's, a master's, and a doctorate. You're not going to fool this guy. We'll have to raise our thinking if we want to get out of here. So Butler's academic and other achievements led Theodore Roosevelt to call him Nicholas Miraculous. In 1885, Butler studied in Paris and Berlin and became a lifelong friend of future Secretary of State Elihu Root, Phi Beta Kappa, Skull and Bones, Secretary of War. One of these key guys. He's the founder of the preparedness movement in America. This raising of military, the creation of what we have today is highly militarized society. You can thank Elihu Root. So through Root, he also met Roosevelt and William Howard Taft. In the fall of 1885, Butler joined the staff of Columbia's philosophy department. Now, I don't know if he's saying that he met Theodore Roosevelt while in Berlin, because that's what it's, or Elihu Root while in Berlin, and then he was introduced to Roosevelt and William Howard Taft in Berlin. I don't know if that's true, but that's almost how it reads. You have to do the background on Taft and Roosevelt to see if they've gone there and then what time they went. So Nicholas Murray Butler, also the founder, along with Grace Hoadley Dodge. You want me to show you the first logo of Dodge Motor Company? He became president of the New York School for the Training of Teachers, which later affiliated with Columbia University and was renamed the Teachers College, Columbia University. So you want to know where teachers get their talking points and their direction, it comes out of the Teachers College at Columbia, largely. You can see from which a co-educational, experimental, and developmental unit became Horace Mann School. Horace Mann's one of the first guys to go over there and come back and establish our K through 12 education, where he borrows it from Johann Gottlieb Fichte. And if you read the book from Fichte, Addresses to the German Nation, he talks about this new education system that he's going to develop that removes the free will of the student in the soil. That is verbatim to the translation, because I'm sure it was firstly written and spoken in German. And I believe Murray Butler here is the guy that has the negotiations with Max Horkheimer that allows the Frankfurt School to come over and land in Columbia and become the new school, one of the largest social research institutes in America. So you can see he's the first to say, hey, Andrew Carnegie, why don't you provide $10 million and we'll start to create this internationalism through your endowment. Butler became head of international education and communication, founded the European branch of the endowment headquartered in Paris, and was president of the endowment from 25 to 45. For his work in this field, he received the Nobel Prize. Underrated guy in internationalism. He's president of the Pilgrim Society. So you want to talk internationalism? Hic et ubique, here and everywhere. The Pilgrim Society, founded by Sir Harry Britton. You want to look at the members list of the Pilgrim Society. Invite you to go here because you'll see all of these names that we talk about. Henry Luce, the head of Time Life. Douglas Fairbanks, he's involved in, well, Douglas Fairbanks Sr. is involved in the 4-Minute Men and persuading Americans to consult or consent to American involvement in the war. See, key figures: Volcker, George Shultz, Reagan, Walter Cronkite. So those of you that say that they would love to hearken back to the days when the news told you the truth, you know, those days of Walter Cronkite, he admits that there's powers far higher than him culling the news, and he's only telling what they allow him to. Okay, so you want to talk internationalism? This is one of the more influential, more secretive organizations that there is, and you can see that it links up with all of these names that most people fail to realize are progressives, and they are progressives specifically because they are philanthropists. This helping of society, building society through their money. Gone through the Royal Society. This is Francis Bacon's book, The New Atlantis. I encourage you to go look into this. And it talks about kingdoms, states, and the Commonwealth. And this new Atlantis, I'm almost thinking Atlantis isn't a place in our world, but it is our world. Okay, so I'm going to show you some more stuff because we've got World's Fairs to talk about. World's Fairs are very influential. And we opened with that international map of the world, did we not? I think we did. So if I can get these to come up, we'll show you this. Isaiah Bowman's involvement in the creation of this international map of the world. This is one of the key first foundational moments of internationalism. They had to document the entire world first. And Isaiah Bowman was responsible, as I said at the beginning there, with everything south of the Rio Grande in South America. And so here we see the AGS building, the American Geographical Society courtyard at 3755 Broadway in New York. And this is really the founding location of US foreign policy. This is where the inquiry members, the founders of the CFR, go to start drawing all of these maps. And you can see this is a little later. This is sort of the next project after the Paris Peace Conference that Isaiah Bowman heads. So you can see there's somebody out there. It's not Isaiah, but they've connected all the maps out in the courtyard because there wasn't enough room in the AGS building itself. One of my more favorite documents, artifacts. Just how the New World Order works. and it's called the Hispanic Map of the World, millionth map of Hispanic America. Here projected in the traditional blue to brown spectrum of professional cartography are the 12 million square miles of America below the Rio Grande. On a scale of approximately 16 miles to the inch, the millionth map of Hispanic America, actually 1/1,000,000th the size of the actual continent, is the product of 21 years' work by the American Geographical Society, New York City, and is the biggest ever produced by a private institution. And Isaiah Bowman, the real life Indiana Jones, headed it. He had major experience here. So for no comparable continuous area of the Earth's surface, is there a map of such large scale accuracy and beauty? With 5 sheets still in preparation, the map embodies data from government archives, explorers, and pioneering industries. In turn, it has already assumed a crucial role in the political and economic life of the Western Hemisphere, adjusting national boundaries and guiding technological progress into the wilderness. This is the moments of the technocracy founding. And so Howard Scott's hanging out in New York at this time. Okay. Some photographs from the actual Time Life magazine article. Just want to ask you to take note of this particular brick formation here. That's the front steps into the AGS, and I'll just show you in some pictures of the AGS that is exactly where he's at, out in the courtyard. Here's some pictures from the Life magazine article of this Hispanic Map of the World project. I've taken some interior shots of the AGS. So this would have looked very similar to the work that the Inquiry was doing, 15 years prior to this. You can see that they've continued the AGS as being a primary creator of cartography. You can see here represented a nice globe. He's probably referencing to make sure he gets things just right. Rockefeller Foundation came to the rescue promptly and generously. They funded this whole thing. Why wouldn't they? If they're going to want to control the world, they're going to want to know what it looks like, what it is. And to a degree in which you can look over a map and figure out defensive or offensive strategies of how they want to enter a country and best exploit it. I mean, I refer you to War as a Racket. Smedley Butler describes how he was really going in with his military and opening up regional areas around the world in which corporations could then come in and exploit. And I refer you to Halliburton in Iraq. These are just the tactics of an out of control state. Here's some pictures of them creating it inside the AGS again. And you can find this as well at archive.org. And in here, it talks about Isaiah Bowman controlling it, him as the president of the American Geographical Society. And right after this, he goes to be the head of Johns Hopkins University when they're making the Manhattan Project. So interestingly, Isaiah Bowman meeting some of these South American tribes that had never met white people with their spears and bows and arrows. And he finishes his career by developing the greatest weapon of all time, the atomic bomb. So the map of Hispanic America on the scale of 1 to 1 million. That's the document. You can put that title in and then put archive after it, and that will come up. How's it going? Go ahead, do your thing. We're all good. So this AGS building, this is key because this is the founding of US foreign policy, everybody. So where did that happen? 157th is the closest subway stop to the AGS. I think the AGS is right in here. You can see it's only 2 stops from City College. It's where Sidney Mezes went to school. And then it's only 4 stops to Columbia University, where James T. Shotwell was professor. And so there's so much activity actually at the AGS building that James T. Shotwell takes his work back to his office at Columbia University. So you can see that they would have been going back and forth on the subway here in northern Manhattan. Some pictures from the day of that area. This is shortly after the subways have been first created. There's 157th today. And this AGS is created through Charles P. Huntington and his son, Archer M. Huntington, who travels the world looking for all kinds of artifacts. Here's the quadrangle in the back. And this is the building itself. The inquiry, or the founding members of Council on Foreign Relations, are preparing for the Paris Peace Conference from 1917 until 1918 here at the American Geographical Society. So this is the founding building of US foreign policy, if you ask me. You know, you trace it back to source, it goes back to that building. See some of the names on the top: Columbus, Marco Polo, Magellan, Ptolemy, Strabo. And here it is on Google Maps. I got a photo of Woodrow Wilson back in the day stepping down these steps, going to check on the inquiries work. And in their literature, especially Isaiah Bowman, he talks about it. It's open. This is documented historical fact. It is now the Boricua College. I think it's English as a second language. But here is that area that I was saying to keep in mind, because this is where that guy had all of the maps out, right here in the courtyard. Walter Lippmann at this time, central to all of this creation. He's the actual first founding lifetime member of the CFR as secretary. He's the one in charge with the first steps out of the New York Public Library. And as the work sort of expanded, they needed a bigger place and the ability to create maps. And the only place there was this place, AGS. And I think this is why Walter Lippmann goes off and works directly under Pershing, making propaganda pamphlets that get thrown over the enemy lines and interrogating prisoners, because Isaiah Bowman really is best matched for the position of chief territorial specialist of the inquiry. He's got major geographical experience and background in making maps and cartography already by 1917. So we see Walter Lippmann sort of establish the foundations, and then I think through tensions, through a battle for leadership, Isaiah Bowman actually rises to the top, and they use Walter Lippmann in another place. And so these are pictures from the AGS. They are not of that moment. These will not be inquiry members as far as I know, but these are workers, interior staff, showing you that it's very technological and scientific, and they are drawing these maps 1 to 1 million. Here is the foyer, and globe is a sphere, very well represented here. And what does it say on this one? But ubique. So the Pilgrim Society, hic e ubique, here and everywhere, the CFR ubique, everywhere, and the American Geographical Society logo, ubique. Some more interior shots of what the AGS looks like on the inside. So you can imagine all of these guys, Isaiah Bowman and the members of the inquiry, social scientists, political scientists, PhDs in medieval history. They're well equipped to go over to Central Europe, first of all, to draw the maps here and then go over to Central Europe and really control the Paris Peace Conference. And that would make sense because these are the founders of the CFR. Today, really the mothership of US foreign policy is the CFR. There's a photo of it today. You could go there and visit right now. Probably walk right in through the front door. That'd be interesting. If I'm ever in New York, this will be one of my first stops. Here's some pictures from it in the day. And I invite you to go and watch the 3-part series on the inquiry, the creation of the CFR, because we go into this building. Okay, so let's see if I can get to World's Fairs here, and we'll kind of finish off this long road to internationalism. Oh, I know where they are. How do I do this? Hang on, everybody. Where did my little thing go? You know what? I'll expand this large and then I'll get it. There we go. Now, see how those little toolbars just play with you? Highly technical. So, show you some actual documents maybe while we're here. These are straight out of the archives. I think the National Archives or the Office of the Historian. These are official documents of the founding of the inquiry. And we can see Walter Lippmann here, his name on it. I've got all kinds of provenance. If anybody ever wants more substantiation, I've got it over and over and over. This is really just documented historical fact. This sucker goes small, eh? Now, what I want to find as we close out this show, see how it won't come up? And I don't want that actually. I have to shrink this. Hang on. There we go. Now, what am I looking for? The New Atlantis. Because that's where we'll continue on. There we go. Okay. So the New Atlantis should be looking at a full screen. Francis Bacon, a huge inspiration for all of this. And then so we want to go to these World's Fairs and just show you that World's Fairs are very important in the establishment of the idea of this internationalism. And so we'll show you some key contacts, connections back to Prague, and we'll finish with the idea of internationalism really starting in Prague. So a World's Fair, also known as a universal exhibition, is a large global exhibition designed to showcase the achievements of nations. These exhibitions vary in character and are held in different parts of the world at a specific site for a period of time, typically between 3 and 6 months. Now, I would imagine wherever you are in the world, there's been a World's Fair near you. I went to the one here in Vancouver in 1986. We had ourselves our little passports and we went all to different countries' pavilions. And we came out with a real universal idea that the world is a small place after all. So the term World's Fair is commonly used in the United States, while the French term Exposition Universelle, that's interesting, is used in most of Europe and Asia. Other terms include World Expo or Specialized Expo, with the word expo used for various types of exhibitions since at least 1958. Now, when we go to the history of the World's Fair, look at where the first one is. Many people will say London, but it's actually 1791 Prague. That's interesting because that totally is the same year that Jacob Frank dies and 2 years before Philosophie Sociale is published. So Prague organized the first World's Fair in Bohemia. The first international exhibition was on the occasion of the coronation of Leopold II as King of Bohemia. The exhibition was held in the Clementinum and celebrated the considerable sophistication of manufacturing methods in the region during that time. We're seeing that this is actually predating, in many ways, the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, because this raising of science and technology and new manufacturing methods and this industrial competition to further develop things and progress the human condition really is based out of Bohemia. It is upstream of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. These dates don't necessarily tell you that, but we're talking about a time prior to this even. I'm just showing you that the first World's Fair comes from Prague. Progress. Okay, so industrialization, 1851 to 1938. The first era, the era of industrialization, roughly covered the years from 1850 to 1938. You can go back to 1791 for that, because that's exactly why that was established. In these years, world exhibitions were largely focused on trade and displayed technological advances and inventions. World exhibitions were platforms for state-of-the-art science and technology from around the world. The World Expositions of 1851 in London, 1853 in New York, 1862 in London, 1876 in Philadelphia, 78 in Paris, Barcelona, Paris, Prague in 1891, the 100th year anniversary of the first, 1893 in Chicago, 1897 in Brussels, 1900 in Paris, 1904 in St. Louis. That's when they created the Arch in St. Louis. It's one of the buildings or one of the things that stayed there. And then 1915 San Francisco, and then this most famous of all for me is the 1933-34 Chicago World's Fair. It's probably the most notable. And why do I say that? Well, because it's officially known as the Century of Progress International Exhibition. Okay, and really this is where we see and where we can really understand that internationalism and progress and industrial technical advancements are all synonymous. Really, progress, this idea of this myth of human progress, is really driving all of this internationalism. So it really brings us all full circle back to the progressive era. And this 1933-34 Century of Progress International Exhibition, interesting, because, Mussolini famously talked about Century of the State. This is one of his most famous sayings. And it's Mussolini that gifts to America a 2,000-year-old column, Roman column, called the Balbo Monument, and actually has it delivered to Chicago by the leader of the Black Shirts, who was the head of Italian Air Force, I believe, at the time. So at a time when transatlantic flight wasn't exactly routine, we see fascist leaders coming over and delivering 2,000-year-old Roman columns with fasces on them and gifting it to America in 33-34. And that statue still stands in Chicago's waterfront. So with all this woke crying of fascism, I'm absolutely shocked that it's still standing. If the progressives knew history, we'd have ourselves an ally. Unfortunately, right now, they are completely oblivious of this kind of history. The fact that progressives have such an influence on our modern day. And so this all is fueling internationalism. And I'm going to end the show, if I can find it, with the these direct quotes out of Mussolini's writings, in which he talks about the individual. And I may have to take a moment to find that because I'm not sure where they are, unless they're right here. No. So give me a moment and we'll finish this show with talking about this changing definition of what it meant to be a liberal. Because I think that most people out there are pretty well aware that there's been a shifting of the definition of liberalism. And I think we've talked about it in this show and several other shows of how that actually came about. It's really this influence of all of these progressives, Marxists, socialists. Look for my buddy Benito Mussolini. So I'll show you this Balbo monument. I think we've already looked at this. Those of you that are aware of my work, you've seen this. Let me see if I can get it. There it is. So if you haven't seen it, the Balbo monument got fasces on it. It's a 2,000-year-old column. You can see it's still in Chicago today. And there's engravings and a saying there. And so just the other day, I saw where Trump said something about his relationship with Italy being thousands of years old, and the media and everybody around laughing at him, thinking he was the dumbest guy in the world. But this is why he probably said that. 20 centuries old, erected on the beach of Ostia, fascist Italy, by command of Benito Mussolini. Presented to America at the Chicago Century of Progress World's Fair. There was also at Soldier Field a presentation of Moloch and Jewish mysticism in which they packed the stadium. And so Soldier Field, even at that time, held a lot of people. Some of my investigations into the fasces to see how long ago they were created. Here we see 1861, there's fasces there. So oftentimes we'll point to more modern pictures because they both still are there. You can see as late back as 1861, we've got fasces there. And you can, I think a lot of people are starting to realize that there's fasces all over Washington, D.C. in the most hallowed areas. Here's the day that Woodrow Wilson announced involvement in the Great War. He's got two fasces backing him on either side. So then ultimately we need to talk about Lincoln, because at his memorial underneath both hands is a fasces. And you'll see that this is a pattern that we see in Washington, D.C. There's fasces over the entrance door to the Oval Office, several statues of George Washington in which he's cloaking, literally cloaking his fasces with his coat. But that is not why I'm here. We're going to finish this show by quoting directly out of Benito Mussolini's work. We're going to show that all of a sudden, this definition of liberalism that he is expounding sounds a lot like the liberalism that we see today, running around like chickens with their head cut off. And really, they're unaware of this history. They're unaware that they are the creators of fascism. And I'm proving it here that it's American progressives that are founding fascism. It's Woodrow Wilson who initiates the construction of the Lincoln Memorial, 1916. We see dimes being minted in the same year with fasces on it. US American dimes of 1916, there'll be a fasces. So out of the Doctrine of Fascism, page 10 and 11, talking about non-individualistic liberalism and the founding of totalitarianism. So he's speaking about this concept of fascism. And just so you know, this book, Mussolini's My Autobiography, both ghostwritten, edited by Richard Washburn-Child, and we'll probably end with that. But according to Mussolini, anti-individualistic, the fascist conception of life stresses the importance of the state and accepts the individual only so far as his interests coincide with those of the state, which stands for the conscience and the universal will of man as a historic entity. See at the bottom of the page, liberalism denied the state in the name of the individual. Now that is classic liberalism that he's talking about, right? The US constitutional classic liberal who was denying government influence, denying the growth of the administrative state. Fascism reasserts the rights of the state as expressing the real essence of the individual. And if liberty is to be the attribute of living men and not of abstract dummies invented by individualistic liberalism, then fascism stands for liberty, and for the only liberty worth having, the liberty of the state and of the individual within the state. So you're being submerged. This is, again, like the Paris Peace Conference, it's a direct affront to the classic liberal. The fascist conception of the state is all-embracing. Outside of it, no human or spiritual values can exist, much less have value. Thus understood, fascism is totalitarian. And the fascist state, a synthesis and a unit inclusive of all values. It interprets, develops, and potentiates the whole life of a people. So if you go back to Grosvenor Clarkson and his book, I send you back to the First American Fascists, a video I did a couple months ago. We go into his book, and that's exactly how he's talking about. They're going to harness the potential of the whole life of the American people. The American people working in factories were going to be the second wave of soldiers. The blood of the soldier was going to mix with the sweat of the laborer. So fascism recognizes the real needs which gave rise to socialism and trade unionism, giving them due weight in the guild or corporative system in which divergent interests are coordinated and harmonized in the unity of the state. So he's bringing socialism, trade unionism, and anybody else together, harmonized in the unity of the state. Here from page 26, if the 19th century was the century of the individual, liberalism implying individualism, the classic liberal, we are free to believe that this is the collective century, collectivization, collectivism, really internationalism, and therefore the century of the state. So this is why we see connections there with the World's Fair at Chicago as the century of progress. And we see that Mussolini openly advocates the American way. He's cheering America on as they become the main country in the dominance of the 20th century. I mean, we call the 20th century the American century for a reason. And totalitarianism is fascism. This is where that term comes from. This is why when you say totalitarianism, you are referencing directly fascism. So this is history that these progressives that are running around have no idea of. So after the single party, there must be the totalitarian state. Single party. So you can read back to John Stuart Mill, and he talks about having a party of stability and order and another party of progress and change, and they pit those against each other under hostile banners, and one day in the hopes of having one party that envelops both. So this is what we're seeing, the resolve of the left and right. We're seeing the resolve of Canadian and American interests into this technate. It's going to become the match to the EU. So while people will stand for national anthems and hold their hand over their heart, their nationalism is being taken out from underneath them, and it's all just an illusion now. That is to say, the state which absorbs all the energies, all the interests, all the hopes of a people in order to transform and potentiate them. Now, what is the subtitle to the New Freedom written by Woodrow Wilson? But the emancipation of all of the energies of the American people. Okay, and where does Woodrow Wilson go on his way to the Paris Peace Conference? He stops in two places, Britain and Italy, on his way to Paris. Okay. So that's where we're going to leave it. I want you to understand that in order for them to create this international world, they had to alter the definition of the American liberal, obviously, because he's based in constitutional law, and he advocates the classic liberal, which is repugnant to their idea of an international world. And, from James T. Shotwell to several of these guys along the way, they say that this US Constitution, or any country that actually holds a constitution, these are the greatest obstacles that we have towards the creation of the ILO, the League of Nations, and all of these international institutions that we are now really being crushed under. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there, but I want everybody to understand that this world of internationalism that we have today, the creation of the UN, is really established through Moses Dobruska and his Universal Constitution. And we've just traced over the last couple hours here, connecting direct lineages between very interesting characters that show you really the true motivations and intent of all of these. And here we are in the year 2026, nearing this sort of culmination, maybe the landing of the capstone, if you will, on the pyramid. And so we are all living in special times for certain, but it's important that if we were ever to be serious about entertaining the thought of winning here, we're going to have to know our history. And so there isn't any more important history to understand than that of progress, internationalism, and especially the progressive era, because this is where we see the foundations of everything that we are under. And what are they but all designed to domestically make America a nice fit with this international model. So Brandeis, in the first 4 years of Woodrow Wilson's term, they established domestic policy, the Federal Reserve, the Federal Trade Commission, taxation. They alter the U.S. Constitution. And then from 1916 to 1920, Brandeis and Wilson are really establishing the concomitant, overall overarching necessary suprastate in which America is going to fit into. And we see that with Brandeis being at Paris. Very little known fact by many historians that Brandeis actually stops in at Paris for a few days. It's specifically the time that the Treaty of Versailles is signed, and it's specifically when the League of Nations, the covenant of the League of Nations, is founded. And so Walter Lippmann, a key guy in the establishment of that, is 14 points. And out of those 14 points comes Sidney Webb chaired Inter-Allied Socialist and Labor conferences, in which they actually establish all of the technical verbiage. And really that is what carries over to the Paris Peace Conference, these plenary meetings. Everything was already established under the watch of Fabians. And so we're seeing all of these secret societies and these organizations that are social contract theorists and trying to push society into a better place, into a future perfect. They've all aligned under this idea of internationalism, whether you're Virginia Woolf, Mother Jones, they're all pushing for this internationalism. And so in this history, we have an answer and our solution, in that we must be careful on who we allow to make these changes through legislation and regulation. And so once we know the progressive history, we know that the key words that they use, steer society. We see the present state of the progressive era and these leftists. And, remember that this changing definition of liberalism really is defined by the absence or the presence of radical social reform. So if somebody calls you a leftist but wants radical social reform, they're not actually Democrat or leftist. They are, if you chase it to source, Frankist. But ultimately today we can use the language of progressive. And you'll see today everywhere they just use the word liberalism. They don't define it as classic liberal or neoliberal, but this is what we see. The liberalism that really overthrows monarchies and initiates the French Revolution is the same liberalism that comes over here and obfuscates or makes the definition of classic liberalism submit to it. And that's what we've seen over the last 100 years, is the use of this Frankist, Dobruska founded, social science driven, progressive movement towards internationalism. So there is the long road to internationalism. I appreciate you being here and watching. If you've made it this far, thank you. And we'll see you next time at the History of Propaganda. Talk to you later.